The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and fear. I was lying in bed, barely able to lift my head, waiting for surgery that might save my life when I checked my bank account and saw $127.43. My medical fund, $52,000. 15 years of saving. Gone. My hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I called the bank and heard the words that made my blood run cold. A woman came in crying. Said her sister was dying. She signed right in front of me. My sister, Rebecca. I called her. She didn't deny it. She actually laughed, and said, "You think you'll live to spend that money? I needed a car. You're probably not going to make it anyway." The heart monitor beeped steadily as her words sank in. I couldn't breathe. But Rebecca made one mistake. She didn't know I'd spent 12 years working at that hospital. She didn't know who I had access to, and she definitely didn't know what I was about to discover about the $8,000 loan from 5 years ago. Have you ever been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to protect you? My name is Michelle Howard. I'm 36 years old, a financial analyst at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio. I've worked there for 12 years, never a complaint, never a sick day I didn't push through. After my divorce 8 years ago, I built a quiet, stable life alone. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And until a few weeks ago, I thought that was enough. I learned early that asking my family for help meant disappointment. My parents loved me. I believe that, but their love always came with conditions I could never quite meet. I wasn't dramatic enough, needy enough, broken enough to hold their attention. So I stopped asking. I stopped expecting. I became the daughter who was always fine, the one they never worried about because I never gave them reason to. All their concern, all their money, all their energy flowed in one direction toward my younger sister, Rebecca. Rebecca is 32. She's been divorced twice, changes jobs like seasons, and has a talent for turning every failure into someone else's fault. She's charming when she needs something wounded when she's caught, and always has a story. 5 years ago, she called me crying at midnight, saying she'd maxed out her credit cards, and collectors were threatening to garnish her wages. I gave her $8,000. She swore she'd pay me back. She never did. I wrote it off as a hard lesson about family, about trust, about the difference between who people are and who you wish they were. I had no idea how wrong I was about what that money really meant. Our parents still send Rebecca money every month. They've never once asked if I need anything. I suppose they assume I don't. I've spent my whole life making sure that assumption looked true. Then came the diagnosis. The doctor's voice was calm, clinical, almost gentle, as if softening the words could soften what they meant. A tumor. Treatable, she said. Laparoscopic surgery, minimally invasive. But it needed to happen within 8 weeks, and even after insurance, the cost would be $47,000. I sat in that sterile office, nodding like I understood while my mind raced through numbers I'd memorized years ago. My savings account. $52,000. 15 years of brown bag lunches, secondhand furniture, saying no to vacations, and yes to overtime. That fund wasn't just money. It was proof that my quiet, careful, invisible life had been worth something. It was my safety net, my security, my future. And now it was going to save my life. I told my family at a dinner the following week, one of those rare gatherings where everyone pretends we're closer than we are. I wanted to reassure my parents, who are in their late 70s now that I had everything under control. I mentioned the surgery, the timeline, the cost, and then because I wanted them to stop worrying, I mentioned my savings. Rebecca's eyes changed, just for a moment. A sharpness passed through them, though her voice stayed perfectly casual. Which bank do you use? What if you're too sick to access the money yourself? I thought it was concern. I was touched. So I told her the bank name, even mentioned the backup ATM card I kept at home in case of emergencies. I trusted her. She was my sister. My parents' only response was, "Good that you're prepared. Rebecca's car broke down last week. We need to help her buy a new one." I drove home alone that night, watching the streetlights blur past my window, telling myself it didn't matter. I'd learned long ago not to expect anything from them. I had my surgery scheduled, I had my savings, I had a plan. What I didn't have was any idea what was coming. What I didn't know was that Rebecca had done this before and that she was already planning to do it again. 3 days after that dinner, Rebecca showed up at my apartment with a pot of homemade soup and a look of concern I hadn't seen on her face since we were children. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "Let me stay and help. You shouldn't be alone right now." I was exhausted from the medical tests, drained by fear of what was coming. So when my difficult, unreliable sister offered to take care of me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe she was finally growing up. I let her in. I let her make me tea and fuss over me like I mattered. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply, believing maybe I'd been too hard on her all these years. I woke up the next morning to find her gone. She'd left a note saying she had errands, but would check on me later. I thought it was sweet. I had no idea that while I'd been sleeping, she'd moved through my apartment with practiced efficiency. She found my backup ATM card in my desk drawer, right where I'd mentioned it at dinner. She found the notebook where I'd written my PIN. She photographed my driver's license from my wallet. I didn't notice any of it. I was too tired, too desperate to believe someone in my family cared. That desperation made me blind. 1 week later, everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night with pain so sharp I couldn't breathe. By the time the ambulance got me to the emergency room, I was barely conscious. The doctors ran tests, consulted with specialists, and finally told me what I'd been dreading. The tumor was growing faster than expected. They needed to operate within 48 hours, but first they needed a deposit. $25,000. I nodded, still groggy from pain medication, and told them I had savings. I told them it wouldn't be a problem. I believed in that moment that the hardest part was behind me. I had prepared for this. I had done everything right. The next morning, a hospital administrator came with forms to sign. I asked for my phone to transfer the deposit from my savings. I pulled up my banking app and waited for the screen to load. When it did, I thought there must be a mistake. I refreshed the page, logged out and back in, stared at the number until my eyes burned. Balance, $127.43. $52,000. 15 years of sacrifice and discipline reduced to pocket change. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The room seemed to tilt around me. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. I called the bank. A representative confirmed what I couldn't accept. Someone had used a secondary card to make 4 ATM withdrawals over 2 days, $10,000 each, the maximum daily limit. There was also a counter withdrawal for $8,000 made in person with a signature. They transferred me to Mrs. Patterson, a senior officer who had processed the in-person withdrawal. Her voice was heavy with regret. I remember her, a younger woman very upset, crying about her dying sister needing money for treatment. She signed right in front of me. She paused, and I could hear the weight of what she was about to say. I should have looked more carefully at the signature. Something felt off, but she was so convincing, so emotional. I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I let my guard down. I'm so terribly sorry. I thanked her, though none of this was her fault. She'd been manipulated by someone who had clearly done this before, someone whose hand didn't shake when she forged her own sister's name. I called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring, and her voice was so casual, so unbothered, that for a moment I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe someone had stolen my information some other way. But then she spoke, and every illusion I'd ever held about my sister shattered into pieces I would never be able to put back together. "Oh, you found out," she said. Out. Not a question, not an apology, just a flat acknowledgement, like I'd caught her borrowing a sweater without asking. "Rebecca," I whispered, "that money was for my surgery. I could die without it." She laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was so cold, so empty of anything resembling human feeling, that I felt my whole body go numb. "You think you're going to live to spend that money," she said. "Come on, Michelle. Be realistic. I needed a car to get to work to have a life. You're probably not going to make it anyway. Why let good money go to waste sitting in an account for a dead woman?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. The heart monitor beside my bed started beeping faster, and a nurse poked her head in to check on me, but I waved her away. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding, some version of this where my sister hadn't just told me she'd stolen my chance at survival because she wanted a new car. But there was no other version. There was only the truth, and the truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. I called my parents. My hands were still shaking, and my voice broke as I told them what Rebecca had done. I expected shock. I expected outrage. I expected them to say they would fix this, that they would make her give the money back, that they would never let their daughter die, because their other daughter wanted an SUV. Instead, my mother sighed like I was being dramatic. "Rebecca's had a hard life," she said. "2 divorces, no stability. You know how she struggles." My father's voice came through in the background, tired and dismissive. "You've always been the strong one, Michelle. You'll figure something out." And then my mother said she had to go because Rebecca was calling on the other line and the phone went dead. I lay there in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady beep of machines, keeping track of my failing body, and I finally understood. I understood why nothing I ever did was enough. I understood why every sacrifice I made went unnoticed, while every crisis Rebecca created got immediate attention. I understood why I had spent my entire life feeling invisible in my own family. It wasn't because they forgot to love me. It was because they had made a choice years ago, probably before I was even old enough to understand it. Rebecca was the one they would protect, excuse, and fund, no matter what she did. And I was the one they would use to make that possible. I wasn't their daughter. I was their safety net. And safety nets don't get rescued. They just absorb the fall. That night alone in the dark of my hospital room, something inside me finally broke. But here's the thing about breaking: sometimes what falls apart wasn't worth holding together in the first place. And sometimes in the empty space where the old thing used to be, something stronger starts to grow. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't call my parents again, hoping for a different answer. Instead, I lay there in the darkness and made a decision. For 36 years, I had been the one who forgave, who forgot, who absorbed every blow and called it love. That was over. The next morning, I asked the nurse for my phone, and I called the one place I knew could help me fight back the hospital's legal department. Rebecca had spent a decade learning she could take whatever she wanted from me. She was about to discover just how wrong she was. The hospital's legal department answered on the third ring. I explained who I was, what had happened, and what I needed. The woman on the other end listened without interrupting, then said someone would contact me within 24 hours. I hung up and stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. Fighting back meant making this real. It meant admitting that my sister had tried to kill me not with a weapon, but with indifference. It meant accepting that the family I'd spent my whole life trying to belong to had never wanted me at all. But I had made my decision. There was no going back. 2 days after my surgery, a man named David Morrison came to see me. He was from the hospital's legal department, mid-50s, with the kind of calm manner that suggested he'd seen every kind of trouble and wasn't easily shocked. He pulled a chair up to my bed, opened a folder, and began asking questions. I told him everything. The dinner, Rebecca's visit, the stolen ATM card, the forged signature, the phone call, where she'd laughed at the idea of me surviving. He wrote it all down without changing expression. When I finished, he studied the documents I'd gathered: bank statements, withdrawal records, my notes from the conversation with Mrs. Patterson. "The charges are serious," he finally said. "Theft by deception, forgery, potentially identity fraud. These are felonies under Ohio law. Your sister could face real prison time." He looked up from the folder, and something in his eyes sharpened. "But there's something else. The signature forgery on that counter withdrawal, it's clean, confident. Most first-time forgers hesitate. Their hands shake, the letters waver. There's something off about the pressure or the spacing. This one doesn't have any of that. It looks practiced." He paused, letting the words settle between us. "Ms. Howard, people don't just wake up one day knowing how to forge signatures perfectly. I'd like to run some background checks on your sister's financial history, just to be thorough. I thought about the $8,000 5 years ago, the credit card bill that showed up once years back for a store I'd never visited. Small things that never quite added up, but that I'd always explained away because the alternative was too painful to consider." "Do it," I said. "Check everything." The surgery happened. On schedule, laparoscopic, minimally invasive, just as promised. I woke up groggy and sore, but alive. The tumor was out. My prognosis was good. But I couldn't feel relieved, not yet. Not while Rebecca was out there driving the car she'd bought with my survival money. The day after surgery, Dr. Caroline Webb came to my room. She was the hospital director, late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel she could see through any lie. She'd reviewed my situation, she said. 12 years of employment, perfect record, never a complaint, never asking for anything. This hospital doesn't abandon its people, she told me. We're setting up an interest-free payment plan for your surgery. Focus on getting well and fighting your fight. We'll handle the rest. I tried to thank her, but my voice broke. She nodded like she understood and left me alone with the first real kindness I'd received since this nightmare began. Within 3 weeks, I was home recovering faster than expected. The doctors said I was lucky the surgery had gone perfectly, and there was every reason to believe I'd make a full recovery. I didn't feel lucky. I felt angry. And I used that anger to fuel what came next. Every day I worked with Morrison on building the case. We gathered bank records, security footage, phone logs. We documented every withdrawal, every forged signature, every lie Rebecca had told to get her hands on my money. I kept my phone charged and my recorder ready just in case she decided to contact me. And through it all, I maintained complete silence with my family. I didn't call my parents. I didn't respond to Rebecca's occasional texts asking if I was feeling better with little heart emojis that made my stomach turn. I let them think I had given up. I let them believe I was too weak, too sick, too beaten down to fight. Rebecca predictably interpreted my silence as surrender. Why wouldn't she? I had never fought back before. Every time she'd taken something from me, money, attention, our parents' love, I had absorbed the loss and moved on. That was who I was to her, a resource to be exploited, not a person who might one day say enough. 4 weeks after my surgery, she posted a photo on Facebook. Her new SUV gleaming in the sunlight, her smile wide and triumphant. New chapter. New wheels, the caption read. I stared at that photo for a long time at the car she'd bought with the money that was supposed to save my life, at the joy on her face that came from stealing from her dying sister. And I felt something cold settle into my chest, not sadness, not even anger anymore, just certainty. A few days later, she showed up at the hospital. I was there for a follow-up appointment, routine blood work and scans to make sure the cancer hadn't returned. She parked her new SUV right outside the window of the waiting area, positioning it so I couldn't miss it, then walked inside with the satisfied look of someone who had won and wanted to make sure the loser knew it. Nice car, right? She said, settling into the chair beside me, like we were just two sisters catching up. I should really thank you for it. I said nothing. I kept my face blank, my hands folded in my lap. Inside my bag, my phone was recording every word. What are you going to do, sue me? She continued, her voice light, almost playful. Come on, Michelle. Mom and Dad would never let you destroy the family over money. And honestly, you should be grateful someone's actually using that money instead of letting it sit in an account for a dead woman. She patted my arm, stood up, and walked out laughing. I saved the recording. Then I called Morrison. The process server found Rebecca at her favorite coffee shop 3 days after she registered her new license plates. I wasn't there to see it, but Morrison described the scene to me later. Rebecca sitting at a corner table with her latte, scrolling through her phone, probably checking how many likes her SUV photo had gotten. The server walked up, confirmed her identity, and handed her an envelope. Inside, an immediate freeze on all her bank accounts. An injunction preventing her from selling or transferring the vehicle. A summons to appear in civil court within 14 days, and separately, a notice from the county prosecutor's office informing her that they were reviewing the case for potential criminal charges. For the first time in her life, Rebecca's hands shook. She called our parents first. Then she called me once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. I watched her name flash on my screen, listened to the phone buzz against the table, and felt nothing. No guilt, no hesitation. No urge to pick up and smooth things over the way I always had before. I let it ring until it stopped, then went back to my physical therapy exercises. Rebecca had spent 10 years learning that she could take whatever she wanted from me without consequences. She was used to my silence, meaning surrender. She had no idea that this time my silence meant something very different. What she also didn't know was what Morrison had found in his background checks. A credit union loan from 5 years ago, $8,000 taken out in my name with my forged signature. An insurance claim from 4 years ago that I never filed. A pattern of small frauds stretching back over a decade, each one quietly absorbed by a sister who never knew she was being robbed. When that evidence hit the courtroom, it wouldn't just expose what Rebecca had done last month. It would expose who she had been all along. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lights, rows of hard benches. I sat behind Morrison at the plaintiff's table, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Rebecca sat across the aisle with her attorney, a nervous-looking man who kept shuffling papers. She wouldn't look at me. Behind her in the gallery, our parents sat together, looking smaller and older than I remembered. They had come to plead for mercy. They had no idea what was about to happen. Morrison presented the case piece by piece. First came the ATM footage, 4 separate clips showing a woman in a baseball cap making withdrawals at the daily maximum. The cap hid her face, but it couldn't hide the butterfly tattoo on her wrist, the one Rebecca had gotten on her 21st birthday. Next came the bank records, 4 withdrawals of $10,000 each, spaced exactly 24 hours apart. Then the handwriting expert took the stand. "This is definitively not Michelle Howard's writing," she said, pointing to enlarged images. "But what's unusual is the confidence. Most forgeries show hesitation, tremors, inconsistent pressure. This signature shows none of that. It was written by someone who has practiced this before." And then Morrison played the recording. The hospital security footage showed Rebecca walking into the waiting area, settling into the chair beside me, leaning close like we were sharing secrets. But the audio was the real evidence. Her voice filled the courtroom, clear and contemptuous. "What are you going to do, sue me? Mom and Dad would never let you destroy the family over money. And honestly, you should be grateful someone's actually using that money instead of letting it sit in an account for a dead woman." I watched the judge's face as the recording played. Her expression, which had been carefully neutral throughout the proceedings, hardened into something cold. Rebecca's attorney objected, called it inflammatory, demanded it be stricken from the record. The judge denied every motion without even looking at him. Then Morrison requested permission to present additional evidence. "Your Honor, we have documentation of pattern behavior that we believe is relevant to establishing the defendant's intent and methodology." Rebecca's attorney erupted in objections, but the judge overruled him. Morrison pressed a button and a new document appeared on the courtroom screen. A credit union loan application from 5 years ago, $8,000, taken out in my name, with a signature that wasn't mine. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had known Morrison found something in his background checks, but I hadn't seen the actual evidence until this moment. I was learning the truth at the same time as everyone else in that courtroom. Ms. Michelle Howard believed she had lent her sister $8,000 to pay off credit card debt. Morrison explained, his voice calm and methodical. In fact, Rebecca Howard forged her signature on this loan application and listed her own address for all correspondence. When the debt appeared on Michelle's credit report months later, she assumed it was something she'd forgotten, another expense absorbed in the chaos of constantly helping her sister. She paid it off to protect her credit score. She never knew she was paying for her own fraud. More documents appeared on the screen. A car insurance claim from 4 years ago, with my forged signature collecting a payout for an accident I never had. A store credit account opened 3 years ago that I never applied for, maxed out and sent to collections, damaging my credit until I paid it off without ever knowing why it existed. A decade of small frauds, each one quietly absorbed by a sister who never knew she was being robbed. Each one teaching Rebecca that I was an endless, consequence-free resource. The courtroom was absolutely silent. I looked at Rebecca. She had gone pale, her earlier defiance crumbling into something that almost looked like fear. Almost. Mrs. Patterson took the stand next. She was 62 years old, with 30 years in banking, and her hands were clasped so tight in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "I've processed thousands of withdrawals in my career," she said, her voice wavering. "When that woman came in, something felt wrong. Her story was too practiced. The signature didn't quite match our records, but she was crying, saying her sister was dying, that it was an emergency, that every minute mattered." She paused, struggling to continue. I've seen desperate people. I've seen liars. I should have known the difference. But I didn't want to believe someone would do that to their own sister. I let my guard down, and I will never forgive myself for that. She looked directly at me, her eyes filled with regret. I'm so sorry. I spoke for the first time since the proceedings began. You were deceived, I said, keeping my voice steady. So was I for a lot longer than I knew. You're not the one who should be sorry. The judge asked if anyone in the gallery wished to make a statement. My mother stood up, trembling so badly she had to grip the bench in front of her for support. She looked at Rebecca, then at me. She opened her mouth, and for a moment I thought she might finally say the words I'd waited 36 years to hear. Instead, she simply said, "We didn't know. We didn't want to know." She sat back down, unable to meet my eyes. My father, 78 years old and looking every year of it, spoke next. He didn't stand. He just looked at me. Really looked at me, maybe for the first time in my entire life, and said, "We failed you. We've been failing you your whole life. I don't know how to make that right." And the courtroom was silent. It wasn't enough. Everyone knew it wasn't enough. But it was the first true thing either of them had said to me in 36 years. The judge delivered her ruling. Full restitution of $48,000 plus interest and legal fees. The SUV seized immediately and sold at auction to cover damages, and the case formally referred to the county prosecutor's office for criminal charges, forgery, and identity fraud, both felonies under Ohio law. Rebecca broke down completely. She sobbed, she begged, she called out my name and pleaded with me to make it stop, to tell them it was all a misunderstanding, to be the sister who always fixed everything and made the problems go away. I looked at her, really looked at her, at this woman who had stolen from me for a decade, who had laughed at the idea of me dying, who had built her whole life on the assumption that I would always be there to exploit. And I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air was crisp and clean. I was walking toward my car when I heard footsteps behind me. My parents approaching, slowly, hesitantly, like people approaching something precious that they had broken and didn't know how to fix. My mother reached for my hand. "Michelle," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can you ever forgive us?" I looked at their lined faces, their wet eyes, the grief and guilt that had finally caught up with them after 36 years of looking the other way. I had waited my whole life for them to see me, to choose me, to love me, the way they had always loved Rebecca. Now they were asking for forgiveness, not because they had changed, but because they had finally been forced to witness what their favoritism had built. And standing there in the cool afternoon light, I realized the question wasn't whether I could forgive them. The question was whether forgiveness was even the right word for what they were asking, or whether some silences held too long become their own kind of answer. I stood there in the autumn light, looking at my parents, and let the silence stretch between us. My mother's hand was still reaching for mine, trembling. My father stood behind her shoulders, hunched, looking like a man who had just realized the cost of a lifetime of looking away. They wanted forgiveness. They wanted me to say it was okay, that we could go back to being a family. But I had spent 36 years giving them what they wanted, and it had nearly killed me. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said. "I'm not sure forgiveness is what this needs." My mother's face crumpled, but I kept going. For 36 years, I made myself smaller so Rebecca could take up more space. I paid debts I didn't know I owed. I forgave things that shouldn't have been forgiven. I told myself that's what family means, that loving someone means absorbing their damage and pretending it doesn't hurt. I looked at them steadily. I was wrong. That's not family. That's just sacrifice no one asked for and no one appreciated. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I had done enough of both in that hospital room alone in the dark, wondering if I was going to die because my sister wanted a new car. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about clarity. "I'm not cutting you off," I continued, "but I'm done being the person who absorbs everything so this family can pretend it's functional. If you want to be in my life, you'll have to learn a different way. You'll have to see me as someone whose needs matter too. I don't know if you can do that, but I know I can't keep living the way I was." My mother started to speak, but I shook my head. "Not now. I need time. And you need to decide what kind of relationship you actually want, one where I'm a person or one where I'm just the backup plan when Rebecca falls apart." I turned and walked to my car. They didn't follow. It was the first boundary I had ever set with them. It wouldn't be the last. 2 months later, the prosecutor called. They had reviewed all the evidence, the medical fund theft, the forged signatures, the decade of smaller frauds Morrison had uncovered, and they were ready to file charges. Forgery and identity fraud, both felonies, under Ohio law. Rebecca was facing 1 to 3 years in prison. My family mobilized like I had never seen before. My phone rang constantly, my mother crying, my father using his stern voice like I was still a child who needed to be told what to do. Rebecca sent a handwritten letter, 6 pages of apologies and promises to change, full of phrases like, "I never meant to hurt you," and "I was in a dark place," and "Please give me another chance." My parents drove 3 hours to show up at my apartment unannounced, standing in my doorway with desperate eyes begging me to drop the charges. "She's your sister," my mother said. "She made mistakes. Don't destroy her life." I let them finish. I listened to every argument, every plea, every attempt to make me feel guilty for holding Rebecca accountable. And then I responded. "For 10 years, Rebecca destroyed small pieces of my life, and I didn't even know it," I said. "She forged my signature on loans. She opened accounts in my name. She stole from me while I was lying in a hospital bed, possibly dying, and when I called you for help, your response was to tell me to figure it out." I watched their faces as my words landed. "I'm not dropping the charges. Not because I want Rebecca in prison, I don't, but because for the first time in my life, I'm choosing not to protect someone who hurt me. I spent 36 years being this family's shock absorber, the one who took every hit so everyone else could pretend things were fine. That's over now. I'm done." The case went forward. Rebecca pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. The judge sentenced her to 18 months of probation, 150 hours of community service, mandatory financial counseling, and full restitution. No prison time, but a felony record that would follow her for the rest of her life. As she left the courtroom, she looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before. The understanding that actions have consequences. It was a lesson she should have learned decades ago. Better late than never. 6 months after the trial, I barely recognized my own life. My surgery had been successful, the tumor was gone, my prognosis was excellent, and my doctor said there was every reason to believe I would live a long, healthy life. The forced sale of Rebecca's SUV had covered the full restitution, and the money was back in my account where it belonged. The hospital, grateful for my years of service and impressed by how I had handled the crisis, promoted me to senior financial analyst. It was my first promotion in 9 years. I moved to a new apartment, small, but with a balcony overlooking a quiet park. I bought a plant, just a little one, and put it on the railing where it could catch the morning sun. I started taking evening walks for the first time in years, because for the first time I wasn't too exhausted from holding everyone else together to do something just for myself. I was learning at 36 what it felt like to live for myself. It was strange and wonderful and a little bit sad, realizing how much of my life I had given away to people who never appreciated it. But it wasn't too late. That was the thing I kept reminding myself. It wasn't too late to start over. One Sunday morning, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee, watching the light move across the park below. The trees were just starting to turn hints of gold and red appearing among the green. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mrs. Patterson, the bank officer who had processed Rebecca's fraudulent withdrawal. We had stayed in touch after the trial, 2 women bound by the strange experience of being deceived by someone we should have been able to trust. "Retired last month," her message read. "Coffee sometime. I think we understand each other." I smiled and typed back, "I'd like that." I thought about my family. Rebecca was somewhere across the city doing her community service hours, learning for the first time what accountability felt like. My parents were adjusting to a daughter who no longer rushed in to smooth things over, who didn't call every week, who had boundaries they were still learning to respect. I didn't miss them exactly. But I didn't hate them either. I just didn't need them anymore. And sitting there in the quiet morning light, I realized that was the real victory. Not their punishment, not their pain, not even the money I had gotten back or the justice I had won. The real victory was this freedom, the freedom to build a life that didn't depend on people who had failed me, the freedom to choose who I let in and who I kept out, The freedom to finally, after 36 years, be enough for myself. I set down my coffee and watered my little plant. A small ritual, but it was mine. Somewhere across the city, Rebecca was learning that the world doesn't rearrange itself around your needs. Somewhere else, my parents were sitting with a silence they used to fill with excuses. And me, I was thinking about coffee with Mrs. Patterson next week, about the promotion I had earned through my own hard work, about this balcony, this park, this life I had built from the wreckage of the one that was stolen from me. It wasn't the life I had imagined. It wasn't the family I had wanted. But it was true. It was mine. And after 36 years of being someone else's safety net, of absorbing everyone else's falls, of making myself smaller so others could take up more space, that was more than enough. That was everything. Thank you for staying with me through Michelle's story. Before you go, I want to share something important that this story reminded me of, and I hope it stays with you. So many of us grow up believing that being a good person means saying yes to everything, absorbing other people's problems and putting ourselves last. We tell ourselves that family means sacrifice, that love means silence, that keeping the peace is more important than protecting our own hearts. But Michelle's story shows us the truth. Boundaries are not betrayal. Choosing yourself is not selfish. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop protecting the people who keep hurting you. If you recognized yourself in Michelle, if you have spent years being the family's shock absorber, the one who gives and gives while others only take, I want you to know this. It is never too late to change the story. It is never too late to say enough. You deserve to be more than someone else's safety net. You deserve relationships where your needs matter too. You deserve a life that is truly yours. The people who truly love you will not crumble when you set boundaries. They will rise to meet them. And those who cannot accept a version of you that puts yourself first. They were never really loving you. They were loving what you could do for them. There is a big difference. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever had to set a difficult boundary with family? What did you learn from that experience? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you want more stories like this one, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being here. Take care of yourself because you matter. You always have.